A little while back, I did a video about the Return of the Living Dead movies, and everyone seemed to like it quite a bit, except YouTube, who slapped it with an adults only label, which pretty much dried up its views instantaneously. Oh well. But in that video, I only focused on the first film and promised to return to talk about the rest of them. So that's what we're doing here, but I still have some more questions about that first film because loving that movie is not like wearing a costume. It's a way of life. Question number 1. What was up with Trash's face? Linnea Quigley's trash is easily one of the most iconic parts of the first movie. Not only did she give one of the more memorable moments early on, but she was also one of the more standout villains in the second half. But in the few times that we're able to see her face, it's taken on a very different look. Her hair has gone wild, spiking out, even though when we last saw it, it was looking like a sad, wet hen. But now she's back from the grave, ready to party, and properly coiffed. Besides that, her entire facial structure has changed. The lines in her face have become furrowed, and she can unhinge her jaw like an anaconda chowing down on John Voight. It's not something that comes and goes either. Every time we see the zombie version of her, she appears this way. And here's the thing, no other zombie looks this way. Like, there's sort of a variety of different zombie phases here, but keep in mind, almost all of these are decayed corpses that have been under the ground. We don't see many of the living dead that have been transformed, but there are a few. Freddy and Frank are the closest comparison since we see them change into zombies right before our eyes. Frank's situation is a little gray since he still has the foresight to destroy himself via the crematorium, so it's debatable if he's fully turned or not. It's possible that he's not quite fully undead yet, but Freddy, yeah, Freddy's a full-on zombie, completely turned. And we see his face quite a bit, and it's not monster looking in any way, shape, or form. His face has some sort of transformative quality to it since he has a more ghostly pallor, but he's nowhere near the amount of mutation level that Trash has gone through. So she's clearly different. But why? Why is she literally the only one of the undead that this has seemed to happen to? So there's really no reasoning given in the film itself, so we kind of have to extrapolate some guesses. First off, we have to attribute some of it to the trioxin. We know that it's a chemical compound that has a drastic effect on the human body, and I mean drastic. It makes people completely incapable of being killed, including the destruction of their brains. Granted, we never see this tested fully, like we never see a zombie with its brain completely demolished and watch what happens to the body. But what we do see is that the body parts can still operate separated from the body. So this is a change on the molecular level. The entire structure of your body is changed. Now, I made a point in my last set of return questions about talking about how Trash got a fairly direct dose of the trioxin since she was nude and out in the rain, and then got a bunch dumped on her, and then was basically buried in the chemical-soaked dirt, so her exposure to it was intensive. So, the best thing that I have is that the whole purpose of the trioxin originally was to break down marijuana. That's what it was created for, although the side effects were too great, as we can see. Now, even though we don't see her smoking it, we do see a joint being passed around amongst the punks in the graveyard. And even though we don't see Trash partake, I'm kinda assuming that she was. So, perhaps the trioxin did what it was originally meant to do and had an effect on the weed. None of the other zombies would have it in their systems, like maybe Freddy, but since he was at work all day, it's not like it was front and center. But with Trash, it was. So my take on it is that her direct blast of the chemical against her skin and the dirt bath mixed with the stuff's effect on the marijuana in her system further altered her molecular structure, mutating her into something not human, more than zombie, and something we haven't seen before or since. Question number 2. How does the whole pain thing work? Here's one that very easily falls into that whole "it's just a movie, don't think about it too hard" category, but where's the fun in that? Because I know this is just a movie, but this stuff is fun to think about. So no kink shaming, please. But it's a major plot point and upending of the zombie mythos here, since it's said that the reason that these particular ghouls are eating human brains is because it takes the pain away. What pain? The pain of being dead. They say they can feel themselves rot and that death is painful. But here's the thing, these zombies are basically indestructible, and when things are done to them, it doesn't really seem to hurt all that much. I mean, there's times here where they're being shot up and hacked apart and they don't even flinch. So it seems as if they don't really have working nerve endings, even though when Freddy gets the blast of acid to the face, it does seem like it hurts. But the woman zombie is chopped in half and sure doesn't seem to care. Even Freddy himself claims that he breaks his hand on the door and it's coming off, but doesn't seem to indicate that it hurt all that much, so it would seem to me that they don't really feel physical pain. So then what's the pain of being dead? If they can't feel physical pain of being hurt or damaged while being inflicted grievous bodily harm, then why can they feel themselves rot? This is also a bit tricky because, again, there's not a lot of evidence given in the movie itself, but we do have some information that we can extrapolate from. In my previous video, I discussed how the brain is indeed vital to these zombies, even if not all of it. I said that they require at least a small portion of the brain to reanimate, and that the rest of their body represents a sort of hive mind. Also, and this part is fairly important, they appear to maintain memories of their former lives, or at least portions of it. Freddy is able to remember quite a bit of it when he's talking. And it's fair to say that whereas the zombie version is no longer what you would think of as Freddy, it definitely has access to his mind in a way. And that's the key, the memories. You see, the zombies clearly don't have functioning nerves. Hell, some of them don't even have skin. So the conventional concept of something that hurts is out the window. So, my theory is that the so-called pain of being dead is not so much a literal, ouch, that hurts, but the memory of one, that existential pain, the all-consuming thought that your life is over and this half-existence of shambling around and rotting is all that's left. This may be a crude comparison, but it's like when you lose a loved one and their absence from your life is a form of pain. A mental one, to be sure, but a pain nonetheless. So, when they're talking about the pain of being dead, it's a more emotional and metaphoric one. It's that feeling of death within them, the sadness of it all that hurts what's left of their brain. I guess if we had to directly compare it to something, I guess pause this and go listen to Elliott Smith and then come back. See? Yeah, now you know what I mean. Question number 3. What about that cop? Okay, here we go. I was sort of avoiding this one, but I guess we'll dive right in. In my first round of questions, I pointed out that unlike other zombie universes, here it doesn't appear to be very bite-oriented. The only people that we see become zombies are Freddy and Frank, and then Trash, and they're all transformed through the contact with the gas or the rain. So, in that video, I theorized that that was the only way to be turned into a zombie, and being attacked by one doesn't result in you turning into one. Keep in mind, Suicide doesn't come back as a zombie, and neither does Scuzz, so it seems like getting bitten doesn't really do anything. So I felt pretty good about my conclusions. But then, several people in the comments pointed something out. This cop. You see, later on in the movie, some police show up and they're attacked by the zombies and killed. And a little later still, when more officers arrive, a horde of zombies lays an ambush and there's this guy here acting as a sort of bait. And he appears to be one of the cops that was killed earlier. Now, my first instinct was that it was not actually the cop and that it was just one of the other zombies that put on his gear in order to create the distraction. But take a look. This appears to be the same actor, or at least a really similar looking guy, but I'm pretty sure it's the same one, which indicates that he is the cop back from the dead, which makes no sense in the context of the film, because as I stated earlier, Suicide and Scuzz stayed dead, and one could rationalize that was because they were inside and the rain was essential to returning and they weren't exposed to enough of it, so they didn't come back. But the cop was outside, and that makes sense. But again, the zombies eat brains. The paramedic earlier was shown dead on the ground, his head hollowed out, and he didn't come back, and he was outside, and that's because a large portion of his brain was eaten. And as I said earlier, the brain actually is essential to them coming back, even if it can be damaged to some degree and still function. But look at how many zombies swarmed this guy. You're telling me that this many of them flocked around this guy and didn't eat every part of his brain? Like they all just took a nibble? Later on, when we see him, he's wearing a hat, sure, but his head doesn't really look all that damaged. Although I suppose it could be hidden. I theorize that they didn't actually eat trash once they realized that she was already one of them due to her dosage of trioxin, much like Freddy and Frank were already dead. But this guy doesn't have that going for him. It's just weird because it kind of dances around the things that the movie sets up in the first place. So here's what I'm going with, because I love this movie so much and admitting that it screwed up feels wrong to me. So here's the deal. This is not the actual cop. This is a zombie that looks like that cop. When setting up their ambush, they decided to have someone pose as an officer to lay the trap, and they went with one of their number with the most similarities. That's all I got. I know it's weak, so let me hear your better ones down below. Question number 4. Wait, in part 2, how are Frank and Freddy back from the dead? So, Frank and Freddy were pretty prominent characters in the first movie. They set everything in motion, and their transformations are a key part of the movie. But, in the end, they're both gone. Frank burns himself up in the cremation booth, and Freddy is blinded and then destroyed in the nuclear blast. They're both zombified and definitely both atomized. So, there's no chance of them coming back, right? Well, in the second film, we're introduced to Ed and Joey, and they're grave robbers, and they look, well, very familiar. Not only do they look like Frank and Freddy, but they act like them too.
Watch your tongue, boy, if you like this job.
Like this job? Like this job?
And it's clear that they're somehow connected.
It's like we've been here before. It's like a dream, this whole thing. You, me, them.
And they both go through the same fate even, slowly becoming undead from exposure to the gas. So, are they the same people? Like, first off, let's talk about why they're in the film in the first place. Like, it seems that the characters were very, very popular in Japan, and a Japanese distribution group was interested in a sequel, but they would only do so if they were in the movie. Now, obviously, with their fates in the last film, that seemed a bit of an impossible task, but the company was willing to put up a sizable chunk of money if it were to happen, so they found a way to do it. Freddy and Frank are back, but they're not. They gave the Japanese company the same characters, just with different names, but they served the same purpose, and the deal was made and the funding was secured. So, them being in the movie is simply a behind-the-scenes lark and has no story backing. But can we make one up? I mean, there's really nothing here, but we can theorize that these 4 are still somehow linked. After all, they seem to retain a vague sort of memory of the past events and refer to them as a sort of dream. So, my first instinct is to realize that this isn't a sequel, and it's a sort of remake or set in a different continuity. After all, the zombies act quite differently and seem to be at least partially weaker, and then obviously have a weakness, but just have a different vibe in general. And then with the appearance of the doppelganger pair, it could easily be written off as such. But there's the Colonel. It's the same actor, same character, and he says,
Jesus Christ, not again.
Since this is something he's dealt with before, and his presence seems to indicate that this is the same universe. So, here's my totally silly and totally pointless explanation. Ed and Joey are both twin brothers to Frank and Freddy. They were each separated from their brothers at birth, and a sort of cosmic coincidence brought the two pairs together, and their fates are intertwined. Like that stuff you hear about twins, they share a bond, or a psychic link, and that's how they echo the statements and feelings of their long-lost brothers. Question number 5. What happens to the Tarman? So the Tarman is one of the most identifiable characters from the series and probably one of the most famous zombies in horror. There's not a lot of competition there, really, since most zombies are just nameless members of a horde, but there's a few that stand out, and he's one of them. He's a highlight of the first film, and we get a variation of him here, although it's a different one. His face is noticeably changed, mainly due to being a different practical effect creation, and even though it appears to be slightly more advanced technology-wise, it doesn't look as cool. In this one, he manages to get loose in like a drain pipe, and when little Jesse finds him there, he attacks. The kid outwits him, though, and manages to knock him into the water below, but then he's never seen again. So what happened to him? I mean, the first Tarman was pretty resilient. He had his whole head knocked off and kept on coming, although he was ultimately probably destroyed in a nuclear blast. But yeah, he was not easy to kill. So where did this one go? You'd think that he'd show up at some point in the movie, but he just doesn't. Well, in terms of the actual movie itself, his fate is left up in the air. He very easily could have been there in the group of zombies that are destroyed at the power plant, but also very easily could have gotten away. I mean, after all, it would be silly to think that every single zombie in town ended up there, right? I mean, they were all over the place. There were bound to be some that didn't head that way. But there actually is an answer out there, but only in the original script. Now, that's not exactly canon, so take this as fact as much as you want, because really, it's not official. But it says that after Jesse knocked him down into the creek below, he watches as his body simply dissolves and falls to pieces. Apparently, since his form was more rotted and destroyed, it was more susceptible to the running water, and he's destroyed. I'm sure not completely, though, since we know that these zombies have to be completely and totally reduced to nothing, or at least have their brains fully destroyed, but it definitely explains why we don't see him later. Question number 6. Why would electrocution kill them? So the second movie does something that fans of the first find slightly unforgivable. It offers up a way to kill these zombies. In the first one, there's really no way to stop them. Bullets don't work. Pickaxes to the head don't faze them. Chopping them to pieces? Nothing. Really, the only way to kill them is to burn them up into complete nothingness with a fire or a tactical nuke. And over the course of the second film, it seems that's still the case. A headless zombie with a screwdriver in her forehead is still functional. So once again, killing the brain doesn't exactly work. And a zombie can be parts and still function. But then, near the finale of the film, they run a zombie into a sign and it's electrocuted, which seems to kill it, which leads them to come up with a plan to stop them all. They end up luring all the zombies in town to the power plant where they gate them in and then zap them, which seemingly stops them all. But how does that even work? Like, the way that electrocution kills you is that the shock throws off the rhythm of your heart and puts you into cardiac arrest, or just straight up stops your heartbeat. But why would that even work against these zombies when it's very clear that they're not dependent on a heartbeat in any way, shape, or form? Like, theoretically, electrocution shouldn't have any effect on them, but clearly it does. So my answer here is twofold. First up, in regards to the electricity affecting them at all, we have to get a bit science-y, but more likely pseudo-science-y, because, well, we're discussing zombies. So I know that I've already discussed some of the ways that the dead would have to function here. They have to be able to work independently of bodily function, even to the point of acting while separated from their central form. So, my thoughts are that without things like a cardiovascular system that works, and organs and a brain that is only partially responsible for their form of life, then their actions are the result of a series of electrical impulses coursing through their body. Now, that's not far from reality. We're also the product of electricity running through our bodies. Our brain sparks little impulses that keep our body running. And in fact, electrocution is what throws that off, resulting in our hearts stopping. But without those operable organs, perhaps the zombies here are simply totally functioning based off of those impulses keeping them going. Electrocution would be an introduction of a completely separate series of signals that would interfere with what is being sent from what amounts to one of their brains. All they are, really, since we're saying that they're a loosely connected hive mind of material, is electrical signals, which is why electrocution can cease that. I mean, after all, even the third film says that they eat brains to get the electric charge from the neurons. But Then there's the second part. I believe that it's temporary. Much like we see with the freezing bullets in part 3, the electric impulses don't shut them down completely. And after a while, the signals sort themselves out again and they simply come back to life. Again, we see this in part 3, and it would explain why electrocuting is never mentioned as an option. Like, they're fully aware that this is not a full solution. We can even see it at the ending of part 2. The soldiers are coming through with flamethrowers. It's pretty clear that they're going to burn the bodies, making sure that they can't simply restore back to life again. So, if you're all, I like part 2 because it's not so nihilistic and the zombies can be stopped, well, I'm sorry to pee on that parade, but it's most likely not a happy ending. I know, shocking, right? Is that really how I'm ending that? Question number 7. Was CHUD 2 meant to be a Return of the Living Dead sequel? So there was this movie called CHUD, and yes, that's where the term came from. If you've ever referred to someone as a CHUD, it's because of this movie. Anyway, there was a sequel to that film entitled CHUD 2, Bud the CHUD, but the plot was drastically different. The first film involved mutated creatures that lived in the sewers and would attack people who came down there, and also occasionally come up to kill people. But the sequel gives us completely different CHUDs. These ones look a lot more human, are part of a military test, and when they bite you, you become one of them. There's very little similarity to the first film, and in fact, it has more in common with a standard zombie film than anything. And there's a long-standing legend that this is because this was originally meant to be Return of the Living Dead 3. However, after the second film flopped at the box office, they retrofitted it to be a CHUD sequel instead. It's somewhat easy to see how this conclusion was made, considering that it shares a very similar sense of humor, and the plot setup matches as well. Like, the military testing aspect feels like a trioxin experiment, and even the way that CHUDs constantly say meat over and over again is eerily similar to how the zombies say brains. It's even stated as fact on the film's IMDb page under trivia. But let's take a look. Like, first off, contrary to what this legend says, Return 2 didn't exactly flop. Granted, it wasn't extremely profitable, but it did make several million more than it cost, and they did make a part 3 not a whole lot longer afterwards. According to the film's writer, Ed Naha, this is completely rumor, and the film was never intended to be related to Return of the Living Dead in any way. If you throw in the time frame, I feel as if it makes the theory less likely. CHUD 2 was shot in March of 1988, and Return 2 had come out in January. That 2-month window to decide that it was no longer a sequel to Return, and would instead work in a different franchise, with the changes being made in time for filming, seems a bit of a stretch, but it's not impossible, because there's no definitive answer as to if this is fact or not. But I think that given the circumstances, it doesn't seem likely. But again, like I said, not impossible. Question number 8. In part 3, if self-mutilation stops the pain, why didn't that work in the earlier films? Return of the Living Dead 3 introduces a new wrinkle to the condition. When Julie is brought back from the dead, she discovers that she's always hungry for brains. But if she inflicts pain upon herself, that hunger will go away for a while. Now, this is a pretty drastic shift from what they've already established. The zombies in the first film weren't hungry. They were in pain, and that's a pretty big difference. In the original, they were constantly in pain, and they ate the brains to make that pain stop. Here, we're told that the dead are constantly hungry, and that pain can make that go away. And those are two drastically different things, particularly because in the first one, there's moments in which the zombies were shot or wounded or whatever. Like take Freddy. Like Julie, he was freshly converted, and right afterwards, he has acid thrown in his face. This seems to, I guess, somewhat hurt him, or I suppose somewhat disorient him. But to be honest, the concept of them even feeling pain seems a little weird, since their organs don't seem to function, and their nerve endings don't necessarily attach to anything, particularly if those body parts are severed. But, like I said, the pain could be more of a psychological effect than a physical one. But, regardless, the answer here comes down to the form of zombification. we see that the military is using a barrel of trioxin 245 in their experiment, and the barrel does look rather aged. And they mention the specifics of the original testing and the unexpected side effects. So it's presumed to be a barrel from the original batch. But there's actually two things that can be going on here. First off, it could be that those barrels aren't completely untampered with. It might be that the chemical on the inside isn't necessarily the original stuff, and they have done further meddling with it in order to try to fine-tune the effects. But I'll admit, it looks like the barrel from the first film, and it seems weird that they'd be able to get the barrels open to alter the contents, and yet there's still one of the zombies stuffed in there. So here's the other option, and it's the one that I like. Perhaps the exact nature of the zombification may be relative to the subject in the barrel and the specific content of the chemical compound inside. Perhaps the trioxin can be modified due to the subject within, like that individual's genetic makeup has an effect on the actual compound. And then take the aging into effect. It's been years since we saw the original outbreak. Perhaps the chemicals alter with age, and what we're seeing is just the continued adaptation and mutation of the substances within. This explains something else as well. Like earlier when I said that comment about how we don't see any zombies infected through bite and only through trioxin content, you may have said, hey, what about in part 3 and beyond? Those zombie bites infected people, even when their brains were chomped. Well, that's true, but I still don't really think that was the case in the first movie. Mainly because we saw that Scuzz and Suicide didn't return as zombies, even though they had both been bitten. But it's true here, for sure, and that could easily come down to the actual substance of the trioxin being altered and having different effects. Question number 9. Why are the zombies so easily killed in parts 4 and 5? Well, I suppose I have to talk about these last two movies, don't I? Well, I guess I don't have to, but there's just so many questions about their hot garbageness that it seems wrong to not at least address them. And you know, one of the biggest complaints about these ones is that the zombies have lost the one thing that made them really special, and that's their complete invulnerability. To remind you, as I stated earlier, in the first couple of movies, nothing short of complete destruction of the zombies' form would kill them. But yet here, a simple headshot will do it, much like a more standard Romero variation. So, what once made for a virtually unstoppable threat is now rendered the same as basically any zombie army, and their intimidation factor drops dramatically. But what's the reason here? Why do these zombies act so different? Because it's more than just that. These ones lose almost all of their intelligence that the other movies show. Sure, there's one or two that seem to be able to talk, but for the most part, they only say brains and seem as mindless as any other franchise's undead. So what's the deal? First up, it's clear that this is most likely in the universe of the original films. There's a newsreel at the beginning stating that the public has an awareness of the previous incidents and show the barrels, and says that there hasn't been an outbreak in over a decade. But then we find out that several barrels of the trioxin exist overseas and they're stored in some old base. This guy says that when orders came to destroy them, they were instead stashed, so it's made clear that they're from that original batch from back in the 60s. But here's the catch. He says it's trioxin 5, not 245. That means two things. One, like I said in the last questions, it's really old. It's been here for quite a while. So it's likely that the age of the chemicals inside have altered its contents. So the zombies it creates may reflect that. But also, if it's actually 5 and not 245, this may be a different version of the chemical. Perhaps there were slight variations of batches back then, and maybe, just maybe, this standard 5 batch always produced the headshot vulnerable versions. Maybe that's the version that Romero himself saw the effects of and why the Dead movies feature zombies that died from brain death.
I thought you said if we destroyed the brain, it'd die.
It worked in the movie!
Well, it ain't working now, Frank.
You mean the movie line?
Well, no. Maybe instead George just saw ones that were produced from this vat. Question number 10. Why does no one in part 5 seem to remember the events of part 4? Several characters survive the events of Part 4 and return in Part 5. They include main characters Julian and his friends Cody and Becky. All three of them come back for Part 5, but weirdly, later on in the film, they encounter both a barrel of trioxin and zombies. And yet, even after all their experiences in the lab in the last one, they don't seem to know what they are. Like, I get that they don't immediately recognize the barrel because they never saw how the zombies were produced in that one, but when people start showing signs of zombification, they have no clue what's going on. But you know, it goes deeper than that, and it goes all the way to the point that I actually think that parts 4 and 5 are not actually sequels to each other. They take place in separate universes. The characters that we see in part 5 are not the same as in part 4. They have the same names as such, but they're from different continuities. And here's why I think that. First off, as I stated, they have no clue what zombies are, and that goes beyond what I said about them not recognizing them from their previous experiences. The previous film established that they were in a universe in which zombie outbreaks had been a thing and were widely reported. When the kids first saw zombies in that one, they were like,
With the zombie petting zoo.
Yeah. I thought they exterminated all these meatheads, huh?
which means that the common person knows about the undead. But here, it's like the first time anyone has ever encountered a zombie. Besides that though, the characters all act different. Cody is a jock in the first one, and yet here, he's the science whiz with no interest in sports. Becky is nerdy in the first one and pretty savvy, and yet in this one she dresses more like a scene girl and acts like an airhead. But the kicker is Julian. In part 4, he finds out that his uncle is responsible for an entire experiment in which zombies are revived. In the course of the movie, he discovers that his parents have been turned into zombies and sees them destroyed. He sees his little brother get eaten by a zombie, and his girlfriend is shot dead. All of these things are as a direct result of his uncle. And in fact, he's aware that his uncle turned his parents into the super zombie things. But then, in the beginning of part 5, when Charles is killed and news about it is given to Julian, he's all bummed out. He's saddened by the passing of the man who got his family and love wiped out. Later on in the movie, when his new girlfriend is about to be killed, he saves her and says, "Your uncle? What about your other girlfriend? Your brother? Your parents?" He doesn't mention any of them and skips right to the mad scientist uncle. And that's because this Julian isn't aware that his uncle is involved in anything. He doesn't have a little brother who was killed by zombies. None of that happened here. I have no idea why they did this, but it's really the only way that these two movies make any sense. So there you have it, 10 more questions about Return of the Living Dead. And this time I included the sequels in the questions, where first one was just the first movie. This one I got to go into some of the later ones. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed these. I hope some of these clarified some of the things I was talking about in the first one and gave some new answers. And yeah, some of these are definitely a little bit sillier. And also, since I'm talking about 4 and 5, which I know no one cares about, yeah, why did I do that? I don't know. If you know, tell me in the comments down below. If you have more questions about this series, tell me in the comments down below. Or if you just want to tell me how much you love these movies, tell me that down there too. Tell me if you're one of those people that like part 2 more than part 1, which I don't get, but you know, you do you. Tell me that. Like the video, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you want notified when new videos are coming out, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help keep this channel going. I'd appreciate that, but I also appreciate you just for watching. So thanks for doing that, and I'll see you very, very shortly for another great video. Thanks, guys, and bye-bye.